Gonna go ahead and share my screen.
Oh, and you can self-introduce as you go, because I know you all sort of, but I don't want to forget one of your accolades, as I introduce you. So I'll let you do that.
Totally fine. Totally fine. I'm just trying to get my window. Oh, that's not what I
That's
want.
not the one yet.
Sorry. Play from the start. There we go. Can you all see that okay?
Yes.
All right, great. So again, thank you so much, Cheryl, for the invitation and introduction. I am Bianca Montrose-Moorhead. I'm really grateful to be here with two of my colleagues, Daniela Schroeder and Lissa Wilson-Becho. We're really excited to share our Garden of Evaluation metaphor and visuals with you all. You can see our garden in the background. The garden in this presentation, we hope, will inspire you to be even more creative than you already are about the approaches you use in practice. In our short time today, we want to talk about 5 areas. I'll talk about the background and motivation for the garden. Daniela will share an overview of the garden's architecture, and Lissa will show you the approaches we have mapped into flowers, briefly talk about who we hope will use the garden, and what we see as the benefits and limitations. So with that, I'm going to dive right in. So there were 4 areas that together were the motivation for the garden. The first was our roles as evaluation educators. So Daniela and I are tenured faculty members, and Lissa directs a federally funded evaluation hub that seeks to build others' evaluation capacity. Through these varied experiences, we came to believe that doing evaluation informed by theory, rather than trying to perfectly replicate a theoretical prototype in practice, is what practitioners want to be able to do. We also think it is a different way to build strong theory-practice connections. Another motivation was our own practice. All 3 of us have and continue to do evaluation, and we all have training in evaluation theory. Yet we all had a common experience once we began practicing evaluation. For all 3 of us, evaluation approaches had become the tools to think with about practice, rather than the tools that prescribe our practice. Our own research also influenced the creation of the garden. This work includes research on translating theory into practice, which Lissa did an entire dissertation on. We've also done research on evaluator education. So for example, I led a study on what competencies, including competencies having to do with evaluation approaches, ought to be included in university curriculum for master's and doctoral programs where evaluators are trained. We've also done research showing how evaluation approaches are one of the unique pieces of knowledge that evaluators bring with them to any project. For example, Daniela led a research study looking at the connection between methods-based evaluation approaches and program development. The last motivation for the garden was other scholarship that we read. So for example, some of you may be familiar with debates about what counts as an approach and whose approaches should be counted. This literature notes that, for example, previous iterations of the evaluation theory tree have been criticized for leaving out important approaches. There's also been other writing that's been helpful, and this is literature on the ways in which evaluators consider and integrate theory, philosophy, ethics, methodology, and so on with the demands of real-world practice. Katerina Bledsoe, for example, has a great article in the American Journal of Evaluation describing the balancing of all of these things. And so that's a bit high-level overview of the 4 areas that led us to create the garden. Now, one question you may have is why a garden with flowers? And there are a few reasons for this. One is that we think an ecosystem metaphor works better for capturing the current state, and it's also flexible enough to adjust as new approaches are developed. 2, it provides the ability to refine and expand on as our understanding evolves. 3, it makes it easier to see how developed an approach is on several dimensions. And lastly, it allows for taking a close-up look at individual approaches for easy comparison. So with that background, let me turn it over to Daniela, who will talk about the architecture of our garden.
All right, thank you, Bianca. So the creation of the garden has truly been an adventure that is going on for almost a decade. That's how long we've been working on this already. Here you see the 10 elements that present the architectural structure of the garden and the individual flowers within the garden, including evaluations underlying philosophical orientation and methodological dispositions, and dimensions of values and valuing, activism for social justice, context promoting use, the breadth and depth of engagement in the evaluation process, and then power dynamics in decision making. I'll briefly zoom into each of those in the next few slides. So we start out with the philosophical orientation of an evaluation approach. In this area, we ask, what worldviews shape evaluation practice? You might be familiar with versions of the evaluation tree, which is probably the prominent way in which theory has been displayed. And these trees are typically branched into philosophical dimensions. Alkin and Christie, for example, have the original tree, and they classified into post-positivist, pragmatist, and constructivist paradigms, while Mertens and Wilson's at the transformative paradigms. And the indigenous paradigm is the most recent addition and has been introduced by Chalisa. Each of these paradigms take a different stance on doing evaluation. These philosophical approaches or orientations are then often supporting methodological choices in our evaluations. Here we ask, what research traditions shape our evaluation practice? Most approaches are influenced by quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods research traditions that all of us are utilizing in our practice to some extent. The next our attention shifts to the issue of values and valuing. The guiding question for values is, to what extent does the approach provide guidance for surfacing and using values in an evaluation? Values typically refer to the principles, beliefs, attitudes, and ethical ideas that guide our evaluation decision-making and judgments. Here we check how important values are within evaluation that use a given approach. This is followed by the dimension of valuing. We ask, to what extent does the approach provide guidance for an implicit or explicit process of determining the merit, worth, or significance of something? That means not all approaches provide such guidance, and there may be different ways to synthesize results from an evaluation into final judgments and evaluative conclusions about what works and what doesn't. And you'll see findings in that in relation to that are quite surprising. Then we have activism for social justice. The guiding question here is, to what extent does the approach provide guidance for taking clear action in support of a cause? Or do advocacy and activism present a primary purpose of the evaluation activities? And by this, we mean that different approaches will take a different stance on what should and shouldn't be done, depending on our training and traditions, right? Then we have context, and this presents another dimension. And here we ask, to what extent does the approach provide guidance for the role that context plays in an evaluation? In some evaluations, context is extremely important, and in others, not considered at all, or the evaluation may be completely decontextualized. Then there's the issue of use. The guiding question here is, to what extent does the approach provide guidance for using findings from an evaluation? In some cases, use is out of the scope of the evaluation, and in others, it's essential. And there are approaches that provide explicit guidance and steps for maximizing evaluation use specifically. Then there is the breadth of engagement in evaluation process. The guiding question is, to what extent does the approach provide guidance on who should be involved in the evaluation process? In some cases, only funders or people in formal power are involved, while in others, program staff are engaged. And yet others include a wide range of people related to the program, including participants and the broader community and audiences. This leads us, of course, to the depth of engagement, because oftentimes we talk about we're engaging all these audiences, but what does that mean, right? So we ask, to what extent does the approach provide guidance for the role that those engaged in the evaluation play? And by this, we mean that people may just be engaged in roles, including simple data collection or data sources. They may serve as consultants on the evaluation, or they may be co-directors and collaborators within the evaluation. Finally, there is the question of power dynamics in evaluation decision-making, right? Who can make decisions about the evaluation, what to do? We ask, to what extent does the approach provide guidance for who is involved in decision-making and how? And here we distinguish between top-down decision-making, which is often the case, right? Cooperative decision-making and collaborative decision-making. So that's a lot, right? I mean, that's very dense. And I wonder, what does this all mean? And to provide further clarity and illustrate the use of this architecture, I pass the baton to Lisa, who will illustrate this a little more clearly.
Thanks, Daniela. So once we had all of these dimensions of practice outlined, we knew that we wanted to create something that was accessible to evaluation practitioners and learners alike. We wanted to make something that allowed a quick and easy comparison of the characteristics across a variety of approaches. So we started by giving approaches numeric ratings that corresponded to where they fell along each of these dimensions. And we plotted those ratings on what started as a radar chart and then morphed into a flower chart. So the length of the petals, they can range from 0 all the way up to 3. You can see those various sizes on the right side of the slide. So the underlying philosophical foundations that Daniela talked about of each of the approach is represented by the colors of the petal. So you have post-positivist leaning approaches in teal, pragmatist in yellow, and so on. Each flower also contains a central disc with a varying pattern. So these patterns distinguish between the methodological dispositions encouraged by each approach. So pulling all of these visual elements together, a garden of evaluation approaches begins to emerge. So here you can see a snapshot of several approaches using our garden framework. So here you can quickly ascertain the different worldviews of each approach by their color, and you can begin to see patterns across the approaches on the practical dimensions by the shape of the petals. So just to give you some examples of what this might look like, looking across approaches, you start to see that approaches in the indigenous and transformative paradigms, the teal and purple flowers, they really place more emphasis on values and power dynamics. You might also notice that 4th generation evaluation is the only approach in this set that really emphasizes valuing, whereas some of the other approaches here don't actually have a petal on the valuing dimension at all. So each of these flowers in the garden is backed by a handout that describes how and why we rated each of the approaches the way we did, and other key details about these approaches. So these handouts are all available online and for free. You can access them through the tiny URL link included on this slide, and I'm going to put it in the chat box in a second as well. So why did we create this, right? So the primary intended purpose of the garden is really to help practitioners. So including students and emerging evaluators, but we really wanted to help practitioners strengthen their capacity to think critically about evaluation approaches and to really use them in practice. So we believe that the garden will encourage reflection and dialogue about which approaches to use for the settings in which the evaluation is occurring. We also think that the garden can help evaluators be aware of what they might be missing by opting for one approach or another, and to support their thinking about where, why, and how to combine those approaches together. We're also excited about the capacity for the garden to allow evaluators to create their own flower. that really reflects their personal preference for practice, and then create a flower that represents the approach preferred in any given context. So that then allows a conversation that can happen about the overlap between an evaluator's personal approach flower and the needs of the context in which they're working in. So every kind of categorization like this has benefits and limitations. So some of the benefits that we want to highlight of the garden of evaluation approaches is that it emphasizes on mapping approaches by multiple dimensions in a way that really facilitates conversation about intentional mixing of approaches in a single evaluation. The garden was also created with inclusion as a guiding principle, so it really leads to a more diverse set of perspectives and voices represented in the garden. Each flower is also really anchored in a detailed handout I talked about before, and that really describes the empirical mixed method analysis that led to each rating. So some of the limitations that we do want to acknowledge include that, it takes time to grow a garden. So in this metaphor, that means that, we haven't mapped all of the evaluation approaches that are out there yet, but we are continuing to release new handouts and new approaches. The garden also reflects the complexity of practice, meaning that it can take a user some time to really get to know the structure of the garden in order to make sure that they can use it in their own practice. We also know that there are more characteristics of evaluation approaches that could be integrated into the garden. So for example, right now we are really engaged in a discussion of how to adequately represent context and culture within this garden metaphor. We also acknowledge our own positionality, and we actively reflect on it in the context of this work. So to close, Will Shadish recognized that without evaluation theory, evaluation practice is little more than a collection of methods and techniques without guiding principles for their application. More recently, Mark noted that approaches can help navigate the choices associated with different schools of thought and varied method options. Sometimes evaluation approaches and theoretical conversations about how to conduct evaluation, they feel really disconnected from the actual doing of evaluation. Evaluation practitioners may think that these kinds of critical reflections are just not for them. But our hope is that the garden of evaluation approaches and the flowers within it can really help evaluators navigate these choices in practice, and that it makes the topic of evaluation approaches accessible and relatable. So Preskill claims herself to be a theoretical practitioner, and we hope that through this presentation and through the garden that you all can grow to see yourself as theoretical practitioners too. So we know we talked through a lot of things in a short amount of time. We do have a lot of information online about this. So you can read about the different approaches in the garden on our Open Science Framework page. So we have all of the handouts published there. And then we actually have two articles, one that was just recently published in the Journal of Multidisciplinary Evaluation. Again, I put the link in the chat. And then one that has been out earlier this year in the American Journal of Evaluation. So thank you so much for listening, and we really look forward to hearing your thoughts and having a conversation about this. Cheryl, do I pass it back to you? Or? Okay.
Yeah, sure. Well, yes, but then back to you, obviously, for the question and answer period.
Absolutely.
But thanks to all of you for this. This is very interesting and thought-provoking. I'm kind of excited today because I didn't really think about having my own flower. So I might have to go play with that and figure out graphics and all of that for doing that. So I think that would be helpful. People are visual in a lot of ways. So just here's kind of my philosophy or my approach to how I do evaluation in a flower. Flowers are happy.
Yeah. And, I will say, if you want to wait to make your own flower, we are kind of developing a set of materials that will help you walk through that thought process and as well as actually do that visual. So you can get one that looks all nice and shiny.
Yeah, because mine would probably look sort of like a child's drawing or something. Oh, wait.
Yeah, I can tell you, I have my students do that in class, and some people will create their own very beautiful flower, and then others will do a Charlie Brown drawing, right? And with crayons, literally. So.
which is creative. However, we want them to be pretty too. So yes, I will wait. All right, Danielle, you have a question.
Yeah, my hand gestures don't seem to be recognizing, and I was looking for the little button. So I was like, it says recognize hand gestures, but I never seem to get it. So you broached on this a little bit, but I wondered if you'd speak a little more to the fact that some of these things may be like there's a temporal aspect to which ones you might apply, or like a longitudinally when you're going on a, say, I'm thinking of in particular of a project that I worked on for 9 years. And at the onset, the approach was it was much more engaged, inclusive, and having them frame how we would evaluate, but then in the structure, like when you talk about the qualitative being attached to, say, indigenous methods more heavily, and that you kind of broach this, but how that might inform like later practices that, that they're not necessarily even in tandem, but you have like a sequencing that might happen whereby you're still capturing the values at the onset, but that might inform a more pragmatic approach later.
Yeah, we're actually currently working on another paper that starts to set out garden areas. And that looks at the temporal dimension, right? It also looks a little bit more at, so we are going from more developmental sort of approaches to more formative approaches to more summative approaches, or like more policy oriented approaches, right? So there's like this whole gamut of approaches, and some approaches are applicable at different times and different situations. And we try to put that into the garden. So as this image with the multiple flowers is expanding, we try to really further classify in which direction it goes, so people can really grab and choose from within the area that is best suited for them.
Right, because I'm imagining from a visualization standpoint, it might be you have a base that might be an indigenous approach and using qualitative methods that you overlay with a pragmatic. So it's not that the pragmatic didn't have a value base, but it was informed by your previous step that might have been a different theoretical approach.
Right.
And so, but it might not be like, I'm imagining the bottom color is, say, whatever that was, teal, or and then your top color becomes navy, but the teal is on the background of what informed your pragmatic approach values. And so you can bring those values forward into the next approach. Or anyway, I like the metaphor because I come from an environmental background prior to evaluations. It speaks to me.
Anyone else have comment or question or thoughts? Wondering, thinking about that context, right now you have, no, I'm not trying to complicate your lives or anything. You have only one flower type. But if you were thinking about the context down the road, maybe it's either the soil. I was thinking, well, maybe it's the soil, the type of soil that the flowers grow in, or a different type of flower. Because like if I'm looking at your backgrounds there, you have the daisies, and then you have they're two different colors. But then you also have those little pink flowers off to the side that I can't tell what those are in that visual, but maybe it's different kinds of flowers for the context. I don't know.
Right. And we try to describe the ecology a little bit better as well, like the influences in the evaluation environment, right? Like where is the evaluation being conducted? What role do stakeholders and other people play in how the evaluation is being done? So we talk a little bit about that as well. And we are currently refining the ecosystem thing a little bit, because it's really complex, right? And it needs to make sense, and it needs to fit with people. So that's one of the things that we've been bouncing around for a long time, like how to make it really like, a groomed garden with all the elements.
Yeah. I was going to say, I love this question or comment, Cheryl, because I think the three of us, sort of have this long-term idea, right, about it really being, an ecosystem. And we actually don't, it's one of those things where like, we know it will look it will continue to evolve, and it'll continue to sort of be anchored in this ecosystem framework. And so it's this balance between how do we provide information in a framework that's really useful for helping practitioners think about this, or helping to communicate about what you're doing in ways that others understand, and also letting it evolve naturally, right? Which is part of the reason you see the wildflowers back here, right? Wildflowers, sort of, that's part of it, right? Is so yeah, it's a longer term vision, and I think we continue to make steps towards that, but also know, you know, we have no idea in the end what it will look like, and I suspect it will just continue to evolve, because that's part of the reason we chose the metaphor, right?
Yeah, to follow up on that, like there even individual evaluation approaches can completely evolve. Like one of the things that we would like to see is we try to map these approaches against the literature, and now the literature is growing, right? So we also hope that the theorists will look at this and will say, whoa, what do they mean? I'm not talking about valuing in my evaluation. Maybe I need to develop this better and really talk about in the literature what I mean by that, right? And that would change the flower. So I hope that this garden will also influence the way in which we as a discipline grow, right?
Yeah, I think it's pretty exciting, just the whole metaphor of the garden, because when you think about, like, you know, I know people tried to do a river, and then there was the tree, obviously, is the biggest famous one. But every one of those, when you started to think about it, you know, and map in your mind where things fit, they always came up short. But because this can grow and change, I think it's a perfect fit for that. Okay, now I've talked enough, so other people jump in.
I had a radial along dimensions assessment of something that we did. And one of the challenges I think of that is how the different components of understanding something speak to each other, or how you make sense of, because there isn't necessarily a prioritization, they're distinct categories, but yet people want to know which one's better, or which one's better for which purposes. And I'm assuming that might be part of the dialogue you have inside of your sheets. But that is kind of where people's minds go. So in the radial sort of dimensional, like I do resilience and sustainability, and that's one of those things where all the components matter and they matter together. But yet you can't say this one's better than that one because it's got a certain amount of it depends, even though there's an overall vulnerability is bad sort of thing. I'm wondering if you've thought about how someone makes sense of these for choosing what works in a particular context, and also also whether there is a dominant approach that's like the Swiss Army knife approach that fits most situations when in doubt, sort of thing.
Yeah, we talk about it, but some of that is problematic, right? So like there are dominant approaches, and the dominant approaches are the ones that are being taught, and that are being taught by certain disciplines, right? Are those the better approaches? Maybe, or maybe not, right? There is also, we're thinking like we're taking a deeper dive into program evaluation in comparison to policy evaluation, right? Where in program evaluation, you often have much more like a front end kind of loaded dimension, while in the policy evaluation, it's really just like quantitative methods, et cetera, et cetera. And the voices of the people around are often not being heard at all anymore. And that's maybe where those come out. We try to refrain from saying, we will say, we make statements about where certain approaches are being used, but we do not judge about better or worse approach, because that is often, or has been determined by power structures, that it's not necessarily what's the better approach, but like what's the loudest voice in the field, the most powerful voice in the field. So we have to be careful there.
You know, I would also add, we mentioned in the limitations the fact that this is a really complex framework, right? Like it takes some time to read it and understand it. And we fully recognize the potential for harm, the fact that people would assume on those radial scales that a flower that's in full bloom, that has all those petals at a 3 rating, is in some ways better, or a flower that has smaller petals is in some ways less than, right? But if you think about a field of wildflowers, that's certainly not the case, right? They're just different. They're serving different purposes. And so one of the things moving forward we really want to do, we talked about making your personal flower, but looking at the project that you're working in or the policy, but really asking questions about the information needs of the context you're working in. Someone mentioned that metaphor of the soil, right? What's the soil there, right? And like, what would it feed into a flower? What kind of flower would thrive in that environment? And so really creating a flower with petals that matches that environment, and then looking for flowers or a combination of flowers that fit that environment, right? So it's not that there's one catch-all, there's no Swiss Army knife, right? It's about finding the flower that fits, that would thrive in the environment of that context or that project.
Isn't that inherently, though, a theoretical approach?
Can you say more about what you mean by, is that a theoretical approach?
There is an environment that might be more conducive to layering values into something versus another environment that is not yet the actual, while the environment might not be conducive to layering values, it might be if you're coming with a lens of forwarding justice, for instance, a justice lens, and you might have then you may be trying to force a flower and actually need to fertilize that flower in an environment that's not conducive to layering values. So, I mean, fitting the type to the environment in some ways is perpetuating the challenges that might be with that environment in the first place. And if you need a big dose of justice and a value lens to certain things, you might have to plant a prairie cone flower in a place that's a little wetter than you're used to.
I love that idea of reflecting on what you bring and your own values as an evaluator, and using that to fertilize the soil of the environment to make sure the flower grows in that social justice area, right? That's great. And, at the end of the day, also, practice is messy. It's not like you make a flower, you make it a plan for your evaluation, and you follow it to a T all the way through, right? That's not how we work. We're constantly making decisions. We're constantly balancing things. And, that's what happens with a garden as well.
I like to reflect on the soil and the power dynamics that Daniela mentioned earlier. And I keep just trying to put those two together in an environment that I'm studying and I'm looking at. And it's so conflicting for me to see what kind of flowers might grow in that environment. But honestly, in an environment where it is very limited in the way they're putting their structure and their flowers, which is something that it's beyond our control. Where can you, or how can you make this garden have an impact with all its flowers on that very limited environment? Although it's the biggest environment, the biggest garden that you can think of when it comes to the evaluation marketplace. But still, you want to have that variation in an environment that is limiting that variation to certain aspects and to certain flowers. What do you do here? You're trying to impact also the practice. So you want to see a theoretical approach, a practice of a different perspective, and put that all together in an environment where it's very limited and try to grow it and try to make better from a perspective of different practitioners and different theorists, right? But they do not have the direct impact on that environment. as a practitioners and as theoretical people who can, scholars who can have that impact, they do not have that access to do the change. So what is the garden going to do in this environment?
I think the best we'll do is raise awareness. There is a demand issue. We as practitioners do what people ask us to do. There is this educational problem, right, Bianca? We talked about those dimensions where it's like the problem that people teach certain models and approaches, and that's what practitioners know, and therefore they don't go beyond that, right? And those are often the approaches that are being forced by funders of evaluation, government, right? They want to see that type of evaluation. Therefore, we train people to do that type of evaluation, right? But in the end, we need to ask, what does that mean for the quality of evaluation, right? And I think, like, what does that mean for social betterment and for quality of evaluation overall, right? If the practitioners are limited in the approaches, in a number of approaches they know, if the funders are limited in a number of approaches we know, right? So I think what we try to do is raise awareness as a first step. I think that's all we can do. What else can we do, Bianca, Alyssa?
Well, I was just going to say, to underline that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Bianca.
Go ahead, Lisa. Go ahead.
I just wanted to underline that last point that Daniela said, right? And say that the burden of awareness of different approaches is not just on evaluators, right? It's not just on those who conduct evaluation, but it's also on those who commission and consume evaluations. Go ahead.
I was going to say something very similar, and so, like, I have been in this situation. So when you were sharing, right, like, I prefer to be very participatory, and I have had clients come to me who want a very arm's length. They often will use things like, I just want an objective and a rigorous, like, and somehow that's at odds with participation, right? So I think about which of those dimensions I can push on. So I think it's twofold. One is, like, are there dimensions I can push on? And I may not necessarily be able to push all the way in the ways that I would prefer and that sort of align with the kinds of things that I think is important. But I also value incremental change. And I think that's part of I think about it as part of, like, my work around evaluation capacity building with my clients that I'm working with, right? Is how do I, even if it's incremental, how do I try to sort of shift their view of what's possible or the kinds of things that we could do, right? It's not always, I don't always see movement, and I'll own that, but it doesn't mean that I also don't raise those questions, because I think that's, I don't know, sometimes part of my job is to be the person who raises those questions, right? Who offers a different perspective, who, brings us other lens. And so yeah.
I always think of that as sort of being either the planter of the seed or the seed carrier, because sometimes things happen after you've left, and that ECB, especially ECB work, you don't often see immediate results, I guess, of your time with people, whoever you're working with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also think, like, trying to get out those dimensions is like it may be a good first step for people to actually think about the dimensions, because, from what I'm observing, most people are right away jumping to method. They don't even think about paradigm. It's just the method, right? We're just looking at method, and method. We don't think about values and valuing. Many people don't think about values and valuing. And they say they do evaluation, right? And we are shocked, like we saw, like, in the approaches we classified, many approaches do not provide any guidance on how to engage in values and valuing, for example, how to identify values. And then there are others that prefer certain sets of values and have very specific description of how valuing should be done, right? So, the idea is to really think about these dimensions. If all practitioners even were familiar with the dimensions and were thinking, oh, those are things I have to think about, I think that may also be a first step to doing better evaluation.
I mean, one way to think about it, and I hadn't thought about this before, but at the beginning of a contract, right, there's a little bit of sort of, framing, scope work, all of those kinds of things. And so potentially there's a way to think about how to turn these questions into questions that clients could answer, and sort of, how do they think about this? How do they, or if you've got different people involved, how the different groups think about it. And then you've got some data to facilitate conversations about what we want to have happen in this evaluation, because we have vastly different ideas about what should happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
again, just trying to brainstorm, but
Mm-hmm. And that's great when these conversations can be had, right? Because sometimes we respond to RFPs of some sort, right? And they're very specific. And then you lock yourself into, and you're stuck in this, okay, this is what I have to do. I cannot even get out of it, the box, right? You're being put in a box. But I think, I mean, that's a problem that we've talked about over the last 20 years, right? Where it's like RFP or terms of references come out and explicitly state what to do. They give you the key questions already, they tell you already whom you have to interview. So in essence, they already know the results, right? And so it's like, how do we, how can we influence that better? And I think that's where Lissa has a really good point with it's the responsibility of the funders of evaluation as well to be knowledgeable about what they need and what may be the right way to think about it.
But they don't know what they don't know. You can't blame them. They do not know because of the limitation that they have, which is really a very interesting fact that you can see within the government of the here. They do not know. From my own experience, they do not know how to distinguish between research, audit, and evaluation, which is the simplest thing that you can think about for evaluators. Mm-hmm. And it's just very interesting how the dilemma that I see is that more beyond the thing that we are studying, we're analyzing. In my view, I think more, even the roadmap, my brain is starting to jump all over the place. Even the roadmap that was provided by AEA to the government so that they have a different perspective of evaluation, it doesn't stress enough the fact that we have to do capacity building on a higher level. They go by their rules and by what acts and procedures that they create, but nothing more than that. They have the Evidence Act now that they're working on, and they look at it as an evidence, not even as evaluation practice. So it's way beyond the limit of what we need to do as evaluators to have an impact on the biggest market of evaluation in the United States. So I see it, to me, it's a dilemma, and I'm trying to find a way to make sense of it. And still, I've been studying it for years, but still I'm not there yet. And every time I try to talk about it, it brings more boundaries and more limitations to me to even to think about a solution. As a practitioner, I would like to see something changing, but it's not up to this point that I'm reading and I'm looking at and I'm studying. It's not. So yeah, that's my dilemma.
Yeah, Ruqaiya, if I said your
yeah.
name right. So, thank you. I just want to say thanks for saying that. I feel like you said something that probably many of us feel on a day-to-day basis. I certainly have and continue to feel that way. So so outside of the garden, I'm going to step outside of the garden for a second. I don't know that we've done a really good job as a profession of communicating what it is that we do, what's unique about what we do, and getting everyone on the same page. There are models for places that have done that. Canada actually is one example, right? They've got the credential system. Part of the credential system was created because there was confusion about what evaluators did. And there were enough people in these sort of powerful places to make that happen. Right? Now, it's not perfect, and I'm not going to say it is, but I also recognize, and I've seen this all over the world. So when I was involved with Eval Youth and working internationally in all kinds of places, these same kinds of dilemmas were happening in all kinds of countries, right? So people were confusing the evaluators with statisticians. Now people are confusing the evaluators with data scientists, right? We're sort of seeing this. So I think it's not unique to our experience in the United States. I think it's not unique to what we see across the globe in terms of what has happened for evaluation. One thing that I think I can't quite get my head around that is unique about the US context is that we are a country that has fully embraced the idea of free markets. It is in the very fabric of how this country was created. You come, it is the land of opportunity for some, okay? But this is the tagline, it's a land of opportunity, right? And so we have, part of this is the idea of we have all of these markets. And I feel like in the US, what evaluation has become is this marketable good, and I worry about whether it's seen as just this thing you can purchase, right? As opposed to its own profession, its own sort of discipline, who have really smart, really well-trained practitioners, right? Who do this unique thing, right? So if you think about other fields that have practitioners, medicine, law, right? Like education, nurses. I mean, again, there's all these different, it's very clear what they do, right? And everyone is sort of on the same page. I feel like in evaluation, we're just still struggling to get everyone on the same page about what it is that we do, right? What is our unique contribution? How do we show up in this landscape? And I worry that part of that hasn't just been about us and what we're doing as a field, but it's also the context in which we're trying to do all this work with sort of this idea of competition and sort of, the best rises to the top. I just worry that it becomes harder then to do some of that. So it doesn't necessarily solve the problem, but it's just another way to say, I hear you, I recognize it, I have some of the same frustrations. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're almost at time. So does anyone else have anything for conversation? These have been very fascinating conversation, and Rakaya, I think we all hear you there. So I want to thank our speakers again, and this has been a great conversation. Hopefully we've expanded each other's thinking a little bit around these things, and we can come back together at another point and talk about this further. And I will see all of you who are available next month, same time, same place for now. Well, eventually we're going to meet in person, but for now we're still here. So thank you all again for coming today. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
You.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.